Good evening. My name is Kate Mianwa, and I am the co-chair of Solas NUA. Solas NUA is a multidisciplinary arts organization based here in Washington, D.C., whose mission is to present the best of contemporary Irish art to our audiences. Tonight, we and our partners, New York University and Washington, D.C., are proud to screen the 2008 documentary, Frederick Douglass and the White Negro, as part of Solas NUA's Irish Popcorn series. As the short video introduction of the film from its writer and director, John Doherty, reminds us, the film's themes and history portrayed, and most importantly, Frederick Douglass himself, are even more relevant to the events of 2020 than could have ever been imagined when this film was produced 12 years ago. We also want to celebrate this screening as a commemoration of the publication of Douglass's first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, 175 years ago, and Douglass's first journey to Ireland when he disembarked in Dublin, August 31st, 1845. The film will be followed by a panel discussion and Q&A session, so let me make some brief introductions with more to follow after the film of our esteemed panelists who will engage in conversation about the film, Frederick Douglass, Douglass's experiences in Ireland, and the way his history and legacy continue to inform and inspire all those engaged in the struggle for social justice for all. We are most honored to have with us Kenneth B. Morris Jr., the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. Oh, and by the way, he's also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. Ken's life work has become the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative, an abolitionist and anti-racist organization focused on the struggle for racial equity and an end to human exploitation. We are also so very pleased to welcome Dr. Christine Kinealy, Professor of History at Quinnipiac University in Hampton, Connecticut. She is the director of Ireland's Great Hunger Institute, which is housed at Quinnipiac. She is an expert on Douglass's multiple speeches made during his Irish and Great Britain voyages, recently annotating and publishing the full body of that work. Both of our panelists are also in leadership roles of the Frederick Douglass Ireland Project, which Ken's mother, Nettie Washington Douglass, who we will meet in the film, is also a part of. We'll learn more about that project in the post-film discussion. Solas NUA's journey with the Frederick Douglass history and its potential for good and relevant storytelling began back in 2018, when we commissioned a play co-written by Irish playwright Deirdre Kinahan and DC-based playwright Salmaine 24. The ensuing performances of the Frederick Douglass Project, staged on a pier in the Anacostia River, facing Cedar Hill, the final home of Frederick Douglass, brought this story to our sold-out Washington audiences. We were also able to stage the performance for 400 DC public school students at the Metropolitan AME Church in downtown DC, where Douglass had been a parishioner. I'll talk a little more about additional programming coming out this October, extending some of the Frederick Douglass Project. And of course, let me thank New York University, Washington, D.C. Academic Center, our co-sponsor of the screening tonight, and particularly Tom McIntyre, Director of External Affairs at the Center and Deputy Director of the John Broadham Center at New York University. And I'm also pleased to say he's a member of the Solas NUA board. And a very special shout out to Sean Wren for organizing this and future monthly Irish popcorn events for Solas NUA. We'll hear more about that and other future offerings after the film. I do want to say before we start our viewing, let me inform you that a Black actor, Marcus Valentine, recites many quotes from Frederick Douglass's writings in the film. The charged and complex N-word is fully articulated in these quotes. Douglass's records these words as coming from the mouths of those who sought to degrade him and all others like him. Douglass's refusal to allow pejorative language to hold him back is part and parcel of the fighting character he developed throughout his lifetime. Now, we do have a very large audience this evening, and we know you will have questions for our panelists, and we hope to get to them all. Please enter those questions into the Q&A feature at the base of your screen. And now I would say sit back and experience this take on a very unique piece of US and Irish history, and we will see you at the end of the film. We will start with a short 4-minute introduction from John Doherty, and then the film itself has a runtime of 52 minutes. So we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Hello, my name's John Doherty. I am the director of Frederick Douglass and the White Negro. I'd like to give a big thanks to Solas for including our film in the Irish Popcorn event. Um, Unfortunately, it's online and not in a cinema, which would have been excellent, but and it's very late at night here, so I made this little video in case, for whatever reason, I can't make the live session. I'd like to mention two people who were included in the film and who unfortunately passed away since the making of the film. Jim McGowan and Noel Ignatieff, which was quite recent, who wrote the book How the Irish Became White. Some of you might be familiar with it. I think it was a real driving force behind the film. And his final line in the film, and the final line of the film, I think sums up the whole film, and I was very happy to end it with that line, which you will hear and see soon. Many of the themes in the film are even more relevant today than 2008. Unfortunately, let's say unfortunately. In 2008, we were just, when we were finishing the film, editing the film, we were just really getting to know Barack Obama. And if we'd known the success he was going to have very soon after, I would have included a quote from him in the film, but that timing was just off, I suppose. But, we made the film when we made the film, so. For me, this film is most importantly about solidarity. It's about getting beyond skin colour, prejudice, hate, selfishness. It's about striving for justice and equality. And unfortunately, the film is more relevant today than it was when we made it in 2008, which I find depressing. But there is still plenty to be positive about. The Black Lives Movement has made huge strides with recognition around the world this year, unfortunately, with the killing of George Floyd. But hopefully this film will live on and be part of that movement and discussion, and hopefully have a positive effect. That's all I can wish for. So again, thanks for watching the film. Thanks to everybody involved. NYU, Solas Nua, and hopefully you'll enjoy the film and there'll be a good discussion afterwards. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, there we go. So a lot packed into 52 minutes. Quite a remarkable film. Again, being that it is 12 years old, how incredibly contemporary so much of what it says. Could we start maybe by each of you reacting to that? Essentially what John Doherty says in his intro. It is so on topic and so contemporary. Ken, you want to start us off with that?
Yes, thank you. Well, the movie is powerful and it still resonates today, especially in the times that we find ourselves in this country with this divisive climate and the rhetoric of hate speech and racist rhetoric and sexist, xenophobic rhetoric. And when we talk about Frederick Douglass and his words that that he wrote so long ago, those words are as relevant today as they were all of those years ago. So I was really moved. I hadn't seen the film in a number of years, and it is very powerful. And it was great to see my mom in there looking so wonderful.
She does. She does look wonderful. Christine, reaction to the sort of today relevance of this film right now.
Okay, I'll start with a light note. Ken, your mum gets younger every year. How does she do it? She's incredible. Just lovely to hear her words. It's very poignant. So I'm not American. I came to America 2007, 2008, just as Barack Obama was about to be elected. And I was very excited. Obviously, I supported him. And to me, I thought and hoped that would be a new beginning. I was so wrong. And during his presidency, I just saw how badly he was treated. And now I'm living through how badly his legacy is treated. So to see this film and to hear Frederick's words, which are just relevant, inspiring, it's wonderful in that sense, but it's also depressing that we seem to make strides forward and then we seem to go backwards. And sadly, I think at the moment we're just in a place that we could go either way. It just seems a very fractious place. I hope we go forward, and I hope people watch this film and take some comfort from it. But I think we're in difficult times.
Well, and I am particularly struck by Noel Ignatieve's closing remarks and his question about white folk having to make a decision. And that's where we are right now. And this is a conversation that just keeps happening over and over and over again. So I'm also struck. I've seen the film a couple of times. I'm struck at just how it speaks so much to what's happening now. We do have some really interesting questions, but I do also want to give both Ken and Christine the opportunity to talk a little bit more about their own sort of personal journey in the life and history of Frederick Douglass. For Ken, it's pretty easy for you. I think I mentioned before, I just reread your afterword in the great book, Picturing Frederick Douglass. And you talk about that you weren't really pressured as a young man to sort of carry the mantle of Frederick Douglass. I mean, you knew you came from incredible legacy and lineage, as it were. What was it about Frederick Douglass and growing up with him, always there in the background? What happened that sort of put that switch into you that became your founding of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative and all the work, etc.? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's quite a story and a remarkable journey. I am the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, as you noted in the introduction. And there was never a time when someone came to me and said, Kenny, you need to sit down. There's something that really important that we have to tell you. I've just always known. I spent all of my summers in Frederick Douglass's summer beach house on the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. It was built by my great-great-grandfather, Charles, who was Frederick and Anna's youngest son. Charles built the home as a retirement home for his father. And he asked Frederick, are there any special features that you want in the house? And Frederick had two requests. He wanted it to point in a certain direction, and he wanted a tower at the top of the house. And what he wanted to do at the end of his life was to sit in that tower and look back across the water, look back across the Chesapeake Bay, because on the other side you can see land, and that land is the eastern shore of Maryland, where he had been born into slavery with the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And he never wanted to forget where he had come from, even though he had been born into the horrific institution of slavery. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of months before the house was completed, but I spent all of my summers there as a boy and as a teenager, and everywhere in that house were images of my ancestors, Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. And I could feel at around 5 or 6 years old, when I started to notice that my ancestors were on statues and they were on money and bridges were named for them, schools, libraries were named for them. And I would ask my friends and my classmates, are your grandparents on statues? And they would respond, no, I don't think so. So I would start to feel that weight of expectation as a young man. And then as I got older, I saw what the pressure had done to some of the family members that came before me. And when I was born and I had this dual legacy of Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass, my parents didn't want to put that kind of pressure on me. So they really let me figure it out on my own. And I really spent most of my life, as I described, decisively disengaged in this lineage until Providence called in my life. And that was in 2005. I read a National Geographic magazine. It was actually a 2003 edition, but I read it in 2005. And the headline was 21st Century Slaves. And it was about human trafficking in modern day slavery and human trafficking existing in every country around the world, including here in the United States. And at that time, my daughters were 12 and 9. And I remember reading a separate research article about a 12-year-old girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia and service countless men almost every single day. So this young lady was the same age as my older daughter. And I was reading it at night in my living room, and down the hallway, I could hear my girls getting ready for bed, and they were laughing and telling bedtime stories and about to get tucked safely into bed. And my mind just starts racing, and I can't wrap my mind around what I'm reading about this girl being brutalized and dehumanized and exploited, and what I was hearing in my daughters. And I thought, that's what young girls and boys should be doing, is getting tucked safely into bed. And I walked in to say goodnight to them, and I had this moment where I couldn't even look them in the eyes. And it really was almost instantaneously that everything just started firing up inside of me, that I realized that I had been wasting this lineage that I had been blessed with and this platform that was afforded to me. And right then and there, I decided I was going to do something about it. And a couple years later, in 2007, we founded the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, and our work is human trafficking prevention, education in K through 12 schools.
Thank you. And Christine, what drew you to the Frederick Douglass story?
So I'm a historian, an Irish historian, and my main research is traditionally on the Great Famine, which, it was alluded to in the film, was triggered by the failure of the potato blight in 1845. So I'd done a lot of research on the famine for many years, written about it. And because of my work, I was at one point asked, would I write a biography of Daniel O'Connell? And for me, Daniel O'Connell was this mystical figure who was iconic in some ways, but also had some flaws. So I came to the project with some skepticism, and I knew him as the liberator of the Irish people, as the man who won Catholic emancipation for Ireland, and the man who tried to win independence for Ireland, didn't succeed. But what I didn't realize, and this is over 10 years ago, as I entered this project, was Daniel O'Connell was in fact a great international champion of human rights. So not only did he champion Catholic emancipation in Ireland, he championed Jewish emancipation, wherever Jews were oppressed. He championed the Maoris in New Zealand, Aborigines in Australia, the slaves in British India, and of course, the enslaved people in America. And he was the most effective champion. So a lot of people who know the history of slavery know about William Wilberforce, but really in the 30s and 40s, Daniel O'Connell was the transatlantic, as they said in the film, superstar of abolition. So as a result of that, I sort of revised my opinion of Daniel O'Connell, and I wrote whatever I had to write. But through that, I came to see he had this relationship with this young so-called fugitive slave, Frederick Douglass. And I became interested, and one of my friends in Ireland said, well, Frederick Douglass came to Ireland, he made a few speeches, why don't you just write them down? We don't know what he said. So this was 10 years ago. I started writing them down, and I didn't realize there were 50 speeches. None of them had been written down properly, so I had to go to newspapers in order to collate them. And sometimes Frederick would speak for over 2 hours without notes. So He was amazing, and each speech was different, and each speech was so eloquent and so beautiful, so beautifully presented and argued. He was an incredible orator. So this became my mission, and it probably took me 8 years, but it sort of became, in my darker moments, transcribing Frederick's speeches became, I say a labor of love, it really did. And I felt, I got to know Frederick because I transcribed his letters, his speeches, and his relationship with Ireland, which was very, very special. And we've heard the draft riots, which there is no justifying. At times he was frustrated with Irish Americans, not a doubt. But essentially his relationship with Ireland was something that he really cherished throughout his life, and something that he used the word transformed him. So that was how I got into Frederick Douglass. And if I can just say, as I was doing my research on Frederick Douglass and this amazing man who came to Ireland in 1845, that I came to realise there were other Black abolitionists who came to Ireland. So Frederick wasn't the first, he wasn't the last, he's the most well known. And so that in turn has led me to my current research, which is on other Black abolitionists who came to Ireland, including women.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and of course, as a champion of women, there's so much that's happening today that just references back to Frederick Douglass, and thinking about his support of the suffragist movement, his long-standing relationship with women who were involved in the activities. What I'd like to ask is something referred to in the film by one of the speakers, that in fact, women were quite charmed by Frederick Douglass when he was in Ireland. Who would like to speak to that? Because I think there is something to that. I mean, we certainly see, again, in picturing Frederick Douglass, he was very, very serious and very composed and intentional about how he looked in these photographs. He had a tremendous sartorial sense. But he also, obviously from the works and the writings that he had, he also felt very strongly that women did have the same rights and opportunity as men. But what about this notion of him being sort of the rock star during the trips? Ken, you're smiling. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I'll start by talking about, well, his blood does flow through my veins, so I'm very proud of that part of his existence. But picturing Frederick Douglass, I'll start with that first, because I think it's amazing that only 2 years removed from slavery, at the age of 22, this young man in Frederick Douglass understood that this new technology that he was coming of age with, photography, he could use to help make his arguments for liberation and equality, in addition to his oratory and his writings. And he understood that he needed to shatter the notion in the public consciousness, and we heard it in the film, that these were savages from Africa that were not worthy of freedom, not worthy of citizenship. Perhaps they're better off in slavery. They can't take care of themselves. They're getting the Christian religion. Listen to the happy songs that they're singing. And so Frederick knew that he needed to change that notion. And so he was very deliberate in the way that he went about being photographed. And we made the case that he was the most photographed American of the 19th century, photographed more than President Lincoln, more than Ulysses S. Grant, more than General Custer. And he said, when you look at a photograph of me, you're never going to think that I'm a happy, amiable fugitive slave. And you're never going to deny that I'm a man worthy of freedom and worthy of citizenship. So he was very strategic in the way that he went about presenting himself. Even, at the time, the backgrounds in photography were very ornate, and he had plain backgrounds because he wanted the focus to be on him. So you see him well dressed. He was also, as I would call, a fashionista in his hairstyles, his goatees, his beard. He would really set trends ahead of everybody else. But he was, again, strategic in the way that he went about doing this. When he is 27 years old and he writes his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, that book became a bestseller, selling 5,000 copies in the first 3 months. It made him an instant celebrity and a household name. And it shows the courage that he had, because in that book, he named names and he named places. And the notoriety of that best-selling book threatened his freedom. And so he would have to flee, as we heard in the film, to Europe for a couple of years. So I imagine when he gets over there and he gets this welcoming reception, and he sees that he's not being judged by the color of his skin, he doesn't have the dog catchers or the slave catchers on his heels, he must have felt pretty good. And he was a good-looking man. He was tall. He was brilliant. He was theatrical. He's charismatic. In his speaking, he was eloquent. So I imagine that there were a lot of people that were probably pretty attracted to him.
Well, and it sounds like he was just, he was charming and people were charmed by him.
Yes.
And obviously his message also resonated with them. Christine, there's something very special though, isn't there, about the reprint that he had to get, was it Webb, to do in Dublin? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? William Lloyd Garrison had written the introduction to the first printing of his autobiography in the States. But when he got to Dublin and Webb agreed to republish this, what happened?
Yeah, so Frederick, as we heard, he wrote his narrative, and again, he was not the first Black abolitionist to write a narrative, but he was probably the most successful Black abolitionist in terms of his narrative. It was published in Boston in May 1845. It propelled him, as Ken said, to celebrity status, but it put him in danger of being recaptured. There was a Fugitive Slave Act of 1794, so at any stage he could have been recaptured and re-enslaved. So he was persuaded, despite having a wife or little children, to leave America, effectively to go into exile. And Garrison really wanted him to, because Garrison at this stage wanted to build a transatlantic abolition movement. And who better but to send his superstar overseas? So Frederick went, he landed in Liverpool the end of August, stayed in Liverpool in a temperance hotel. He was a temperance man for almost 2 days. And then he sailed to Dublin. He arrived in Dublin 31st of August, 1845. And his mission for coming to Dublin was that an Irish abolitionist Quaker printer, Richard Davis Webb, had agreed to reprint the narrative. And the idea of this was to give Frederick money through the sales, that when he was traveling in exile, he had some income. So Frederick came to Dublin expecting to stay for 4 days. He was actually hosted by the Webb family, who were very hospitable. They hosted everybody. They actually had a house in what is now Pearse Street, if you know Dublin, so very much central Dublin. So he came for 4 days to oversee the republication of the narrative. The warmth of the welcome was so great, he decided to stay, and he was asked to speak at an anti-slavery meeting. It was successful, and so then, as we know, he traveled the rest of the country. He stayed for 4 months. Again, we heard in the film, the happiest time of his life. Another time he describes his time in Ireland as transformative. But the narrative, the Irish narrative, was brought out in September, the end of September 1845, 2,000 copies. It sold out within weeks. Now, any academic who's ever published a book, we dream of 2,000 copies being sold in our lifetime, never mind. So it was a major success. It tells you the interest of the Irish people. So Davis quickly went into printing another version of the Irish narrative, the narrative. And it's really interesting because what you can see through this interaction is that within a few weeks of Frederick being in Ireland, he really has gained in confidence in terms of agency, in terms of voice, because he says, Garrison wrote the preface to my first one. I want to write my own preface, and he did. So the second Irish edition has a preface written by Frederick Douglass. This is the image, this is the right one, that appeared on the first narrative, and Frederick didn't like it. He felt it made him too European, too anglicized. So he said, I want a different image. And then he said, I want different people to endorse me. So what you really see within a few weeks of Frederick being in Ireland is him taking control, finding his voice, and he starts on the maybe slippery slope of rejecting the control of Garrison. So Ireland is very important in changing Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, and that word transformative, I think we see it in different waves throughout the film and throughout the history. Let's talk a little bit more about the film, but then we have, again, a number of really interesting questions. So I want to make sure we get to them. And also I want to make sure we close this out by talking a little bit more about the Frederick Douglass Ireland Project and all the great things that are going to be happening in the coming year. let's think about something like the draft riots. What do we know about his reaction? It must have been, we can only imagine how wrenching it must have been for Frederick Douglass to see this happening in New York. I think there's a great and understandable explanation within the film as to why there was this frustration, sort of, you know, when you study immigration and immigration history, sort of the ladder, you know, analogy is, you know, you're always trying to go up the ladder and you're kicking down the people below you. And this tension for jobs, this tension for, you know, finding their place in this new world, and this horrible event of the riots. And I think for a lot of people in the United States, they may have learned about the New York City draft riots. They may have learned that it was about people not wanting to go into the army and fight, but much similar to other sort of horrific events that were very central to the race relations going on in the United States, the massacre and the killing of Blacks in this riot is often part of the story that's not told that much. What do we know about his reaction? It must have been horrible for him.
Well, I don't know specifically about his reaction, but I can imagine that it would have been horrible for him and every other person of African descent in the United States to see the killings that went on, the torture of men, women, and children, and how many people suffered, how many people died, and how many people were injured by that. But yes, we've seen in this country a history of race riots. And as Christine talked about a little bit earlier when she was referencing President Obama, how we seem to take steps forward, but then we take steps backward. And I think in this country, anytime white America has perceived that Black people are advancing, whether it be Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Port Royal Experiment in South Carolina, and many other riots and massacres that have happened in this country, it's been perceived Black advancement, and then going in, looting, burning, killing, taking land away from Black people and setting them back. So I imagine that Frederick Douglass was horrified by what happened, but probably not surprised.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me take a moment to take a look at some of these questions. And actually, one of the first questions posed to us, how come the Irish could be hired as a slave for a day or a week, and the Black man was a slave for life?
Do you want me to take that, Ken?
Yeah.
I think that was Noel's way, his phraseology, that Irish people were out for hire, so they gave their labor, and while they gave their labor, they were slaves. I wouldn't necessarily agree. And for an enslaved Black person, they had no choice. They couldn't sell their labor. It was very different. They didn't reap any benefits from their labor, as Frederick wrote. So I wouldn't necessarily have agreed with that phraseology, but I think that's what Noel was saying, that Irish people had a choice because they could market, sell their labor, but at the end of the day, then they could redirect where they wanted to sell their labor to.
Right, and of course they had the freedom of movement and the freedom of where to live, etc. Ken, do you want to?
Yeah, and just add to that, it was race-based slavery in the United States, and so it was written into law that if you were born, if your mother was enslaved, then you were automatically enslaved, as was the case with Frederick Douglass. He was born to an enslaved Black woman and to a white man. It was presumed that his enslaver was his father. And so when you're born into slavery, you never have tasted freedom. You're not able to learn to read and write because, again, written into law, it's illegal at some point to teach enslaved people to read and write. So you're not going to question your condition of enslavement or oppression. And so you become a slave for life, not only in your mind, but written into law.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question that I think I always had too, and I had to do some deep thinking on it. The depiction of the great struggle between Covey, the slave breaker, and Frederick Douglass. The question is, why didn't Covey just have Frederick Douglass killed?
He was property.
Exactly.
There was value to him. When his abolitionist friends purchased his freedom in Newcastle upon Tyne for 150 pounds or $711. That value today would be about $23,000. So when Frederick is sent to Covey to be broken, he wasn't sent there to be killed, because that would be not, I'm sure his enslaver would not be happy that he just lost $23,000. So Covey's job and his reputation was as a slave breaker to break Frederick down to the level of a brute. But fortunately, there was something inside of his spirit that wouldn't allow that to happen. And he rose up and he fought back. And it's a moment of self-liberation in his life. And while he wasn't physically free from the chains that bound him after that encounter, he was on his way to mentally being free.
Yeah. We have another question here, and maybe Christine. Why was Ireland so welcoming?
Oh, I think it goes back to Ireland's own history. So, if you know anything about Irish history, Ireland had been a colony of England, Britain since the 12th century, and Irish people had systematically been denied their civil and human rights. They'd been marginalised, basic political, economic, social, cultural rights had been taken from them. Irish people in their own country were undermined and told they were second-class citizens. And Irish people then use the language, we are slaves, which is a different issue. But so when Frederick came to Ireland, he witnessed people who had, for 600 years, really been oppressed by colonial rule, who periodically and in every generation underwent periods of famine. In between those periods, they were impoverished. He talked about the children in particular, and he felt such compassion for what they were suffering. And he said he had never witnessed such poverty except on the plantation. And then he admired Daniel O'Connell, and he admired his winning of Catholic emancipation. But he saw, even though Catholics are 85% of the people in Ireland, Catholics didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have the right to be in Parliament. They are second-class citizens in their own country. He stayed with Richard Davis. Richard Davis Webb was a Quaker. Quakers were not allowed to sit in the British Parliament, no matter how rich they were, until 1858. So he witnessed all different levels of oppression, of inequality, and I think it really made him refine his thinking. And for Irish people, I think, and Bill Ralston sort of alluded to this, because of their own history, they could empathise. They weren't slaves. I mean, there is a difference. They were not slaves, but they were impoverished, they were marginalised, and they were oppressed. So I think that empathy which Irish people had towards Black abolitionists was something that they felt. They felt they were in somewhere that could welcome them and empathise with them and actually be part of their struggle for independence. And actually the women we talked about who purchased Frederick's slavery, it was women, but they had Irish connections. It's just interesting that we talked about women earlier, but it was women who purchased Frederick's freedom. So maybe women who are also oppressed in so many ways at the time, and Irish people could relate very well to Frederick and vice versa.
We have one rather lengthy question here, but it speaks to a really important issue that I also have a question about. Colin McCann's wonderful novel, Transatlantic, includes the story of Frederick Douglass's 1845 trip to Ireland. In McCann's account, as Douglass becomes aware of the wretched conditions of the poor in Ireland, he brings it up with his Quaker hosts, who were mostly middle class and prosperous. His hosts discouraged his interest in their plight. To what extent is this accurate? And did Douglass see the contradiction in support for abolitionist slavery while ignoring the horrible conditions of the poor in Ireland, as well as calling for emancipation? I would just add to it too, how much, we know that he spoke before many Protestant convocations. To what extent did he actually, or what was his relationship with the Catholic Church in Ireland or the Church of Ireland? How was that different?
And do you want me to answer those?
Yeah, I think you go ahead. Yeah.
So Colin McCann's book is wonderful and it's a great read. In terms of its accuracy regarding Richard Davis Webb and the other Quakers, I would question it, and I don't want to be disrespectful, but the Quakers, they were a minority in Ireland. They were politically, economically disadvantaged. They carved their own niche. They're very successful businessmen, printers, etc. But they were also at the forefront of every progressive movement there was. So they were for animal rights, they were pacifists, they were for women's rights, they were champions of abolition. So to me, Richard Davis Webb is a real hero. And Richard Davis Webb with Joseph Bewley, Jonathan Pym, they were the people who during the Great Famine actually put their lives at risk and went to the most remote parts of Ireland, Erris and County Mayo, and opened up soup kitchens, gave money to the local relief committees. These people are my heroes. So to say that they were not engaged or interested or active during the Great Hunger, they saved many lives. So I would take some, I wouldn't totally agree with the history presented in Transatlantic, but it's a work of literature.
And did he speak to many Catholic groups organized by either the Catholic Church, and did he speak to groups of the Church of Ireland, who of course were very different from the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Quakers, and what do we know about that?
Yeah, so Ken, do you want me to?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
You're the
Sorry,
expert.
we are going to come back to you.
Yeah, no, this is a great partnership. It's great. So Frederick spoke to everyone, and the great thing is he spoke in many secular places. He did speak at the Quaker establishment for one night, but mostly he spoke in secular venues. And when he was in Dublin and Cork and Limerick, he would have spoken to mostly Catholic audiences. When he was in Belfast, he would have spoken to predominantly Protestant audiences. His hosts in different places reflected those religious differences. And one of the great things about Frederick was, in many ways, he did understand the sensitivities, the political sensitivities in Ireland, because when he was in Cork, he's, oh, I love Daniel O'Connell. Not so much when he was in Belfast. And in Belfast, the people, the main anti-slavery society in Belfast, did not like Garrison. Whereas in Dublin and the rest of Southern Ireland, they were Garrisonians. And again, I think it was just the skill of Frederick that he was able to negotiate these differences in a way that didn't offend anybody. And again, for a 27-year-old, this showed a lot of political acumen and so much skill. And he was so skillful that at one point Garrison's like, what's going on? He's about to defect. And in 1846, Garrison actually came over to Britain to keep an eye on Frederick. He was afraid he was doing too well at negotiating the boundaries.
Yeah, and one of the questions here, which I think we've already spoken to, is have you seen the recent social media post that aimed to undermine Black Lives Matter movement by equating slavery with the Irish back in the day, and how the Irish moved on, essentially. What do you think about that? I noticed that there was quite a portrayal of Irish being equally hard done in by this movie. Would you write this in the same way now? And again, this is one of these sort of wonderful notions of looking at a film 12 years old and looking at how events just in the last 6 months has heightened our awareness and understanding about what some of these issues are. And Christine, I think you've made the point that the Irish was not a slave anyway like the Black man was. The Black man was racial slavery, Ken, as you pointed out to us. So I do think that someone looking at this or creating this type of film now would probably be more explicit about that. And Ken, we have a question for you. Can you share your work in encouraging education and reading, which will kind of help us talk a little bit about your republication of the narrative and your purpose in doing that?
At Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, just about everything we do is built on the foundation of literacy. Both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington understood from a very young age that education would be their pathway to freedom. And this really informs our human trafficking prevention work. There was a story that happened in Frederick's life when he was enslaved on the eastern shore of Maryland, around 7 or 8 years old. And we have to use an age range when we talk about him because he didn't know his birthday. He thought that he might have been born in 1817 after he passed away. There was some documentation that was found that showed that he had been born in February 1818. So when he was around 7 or 8, he was chosen from among all of the children on the plantation to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's family. And when he got there, his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, which we heard in the film, didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. She just saw this bright, eager boy in Frederick ready to learn. She was teaching her young son already. And so she just naturally began to teach Frederick his ABCs. And the lessons continued until his masters, his enslaver, found out about them. And his master got angry and forbade the teachings. And he looked at Frederick and he looked at his wife. And this is the way Frederick Douglass understood the message when he would write about it later. He heard his master say, slavery, if you teach him how to read and write, it will unfit him to be a slave. Now, I cleaned it up a little bit as we heard in the film. But Frederick heard that message from his master loud and clear. And he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he would begin to teach himself to read and write. And that would unfit him to be enslaved. He would start to ask questions about his condition. Why am I a slave? And why do you own me? And how come you know your birthday and I don't know my birthday? And he would turn to God. And while he's praying from deliverance from his chains, he would ask God, you know, I don't understand how my master puts on a suit every Sunday and goes to church and in the word and cherry pick scriptures and verses finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, and plunder his property. He's starting to make the differentiation between what he would call the slave-holding Christianity of the land versus the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. And so now he's continuing to be unfit, and this is when he is sent to Covey to be broken. So as far as our work, we looked at that story. We looked at the story of Booker T. Washington walking 500 miles as a 16-year-old boy because he wanted to go to Hampton Institute in Virginia. And we started to develop our education programs, our human trafficking prevention education programs, starting with young people in school to teach them the red flags to look out for, working with their teachers with prevention curricula to help reduce their vulnerability to being trafficked for labor and for sex. And through young people who therefore go out into the community empowered to become a modern day abolitionist like a Frederick Douglass and communicate the inhumanity of today's slavery to the community, we're unfitting communities to allow slavery to exist and thrive. And I'm very excited about the work that we've done over the past 13 years. We've made a lot of progress in California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Texas through a program that we developed called Protect, which is online training of educators and learning how to implement prevention curricula in the classroom. In March of 2019, we moved our headquarters from Atlanta, Georgia to Rochester, New York, Frederick's adopted hometown. And we've begun to do work around racial equity using the same model that we developed through the human trafficking prevention education.
Thank you. One of our questions here, I'm African American and my great-grandfather was Irish. We had believed for a very long time that he was Choctaw. Was that common amongst Irishmen who married African American women? Well, we heard Professor Ferreira talk about how the Irish and the Blacks became very, very intimate in very direct ways. There was a lot of interracial marriage, as we would call it then. And there are so many people that do identify as having relation and ancestors from both those races. And our questioner also asked, where does the term Black Irish come from?
Okay, in Ireland, when we use Black Irish, we use Black in different ways. Black Irish usually refers to somebody from the west of Ireland, because according to tradition, it may not be history, but in the 16th century, when Spain was at war with England and the Spanish Armada was sent to defeat the English Navy, they actually ended up through weird weather off the coast of Ireland, the west coast of Ireland. They were shipwrecked, and these gorgeous, handsome Spanish sailors were shipwrecked off the west coast of Ireland. Of course, they intermarried and mingled with the beautiful Irish women, and their children were not like me, but they were darker. You know, they had dark hair and whatever, often blue eyes, but dark hair, sallow skin, and they were the Black Irish. That's one of the origins of the Black Irish. So, yeah, that's it.
I remember a couple of years ago when, as a volunteer with Solas Nua, on St. Patrick's Day, we would give out free Irish literature. That was our gift, and it remains our gift for St. Patrick's Day. And I remember having a wonderful conversation with a young Black man coming out of the metro at Columbia Heights, and telling us about how Irish he was. and how proud he was to take this book, and he asked for multiple copies, and he was going to share it with his family. And I think that's something that, we have to be reminded of, that, this sort of universality of this experience, and the fact that we are so much more connected. And
Absolutely.
Frederick Douglass really sort of brings that home for us, but also brings home for us the idea that, there is this opportunity for people to essentially share the same values and the same aspirations. So,
Yeah.
Well, I have to say that I did my ancestry DNA several years ago, and I found that I do have Irish ancestry, which I felt like I did because my mom and I traveled to Ireland in 2011 ahead of President Obama's visit as a part of the Frederick Douglass Ireland project. We were just introduced to Kristen Leary, who's an FDFI advisor and director on that project. And my mom and I landed at the airport in Dublin, and we got into a taxi to go to our first event. And the taxi driver asked, why are you here? And we said, because of Frederick Douglass. And he said, I love Frederick Douglass. And so we rode about 45 minutes to the event. And when we got there, he said, any descendants of Frederick Douglass that ride in my taxi never have to pay a fare. And
wow.
so upon our first landing in Ireland, we experienced the same beautiful welcome and reception from the Irish people that Frederick Douglass did. And so while I was there, I just had this feeling that I was connected to the land in some way, that the spirit of the Irish was inside of me. And so when I got the results of that test, I was very happy to hear of my Irish ancestry because I knew it.
And Kate, if I can just follow up,
sure.
I think the latest research suggests 38% of African Americans have some Irish connection, so which is probably higher than what most people think. And just in recognition of that, just earlier this year, an African American Irish diaspora network group was formed. So in terms of recognizing that and promoting that, so I think the connection's a lot stronger. One thing, because I'm interested in the Choctaw Nation, the man who wrote Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, which I love, was actually a Choctaw abolitionist. So again, it just the bonds of oppressed people are so strong.
Yeah, gosh, I'm looking at the time here, and there are many more questions. I think we've answered as many as we can for now, because I do want to have the opportunity for our audience to hear a little bit more about the Frederick Douglass Ireland Project and some of the things that you are engaged in now. You're both on the board of directors for the project. So tell us a little bit about what's happening with the 175th anniversary of the publication of the first narrative, but also coinciding with his first visits to Ireland. Who wants to jump in on that?
Well, I'll jump in first with a little bit. I'm very honored to serve as the director with the project. And in 2014, my mom and Congressman John Lewis traveled to Ireland to kick off the Douglas O'Connell address or lecture, and John Lewis was the keynote speaker at that address. And so one of the things that we're planning around the 175th anniversary, when we can be free to be able to travel again due to COVID-19, we're going to have the second annual address. And of course, we'll be able to honor Congressman Lewis at that event. Kristen and my mom also wrote an op-ed that was published in the Irish Times after Representative Lewis's passing, talking about that visit in 2014 and plans for the future, which include a Douglas Trail and following in the footsteps of Frederick Douglass throughout Ireland. I would love to see all of the places that he visited and be able to, put that up on a website, and perhaps we can put up some resin statues as we did in Rochester. In 2018 was Frederick Douglass's bicentennial, and we worked on a project in Rochester, New York, where we erected 13 resin statues of him around the city that were placed in sites that were significant in his life so that people can visit those statues. There's a QR code at the base. They can scan that and get information about the importance of the site where the statue is, what Frederick Douglass said, what he wrote. And I would love to see something like that in Ireland in the very near future. So we're working on a number of exciting things just to make that connection. And we've talked a lot about how transformative Ireland was in Frederick Douglass's life. And we just want people in the United States to know about the connection, because most people don't know his time in Ireland and how important that was in shaping his mindset really to an internationalist vision for fighting against human rights. And I think that's why you see when he comes back to the United States that he's one of the first statesmen of any race to speak out for women's rights and women's suffrage. And of course, we're in a very important year commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and universal suffrage.
And I think when you make that journey through Ireland, Christine could be your tour guide.
Yeah, no doubt.
Christine, tell us a little bit about your participation in the European Culture Night, which is actually coming up in September 18th, I think.
Yeah, can I first start by paying tribute to Irishmen? We've paid tribute to Congressman John Lewis. I was with him and with your mum, Nettie, in 2014. It was amazing. But two Irishmen to pay tribute to: Don Mullen, who's from Derry, who really initiated the Frederick Douglass Project. So we're here because of him in many ways. And the other Irishman who's also from Derry is John Hume. So when Congressman Lewis was in Ireland, he travelled to Derry, he met John Hume, and together, and they were holding hands. I was there, I tell you, they were holding hands. They walked across the Peace Bridge, and it was really, really moving. These two great champions of civil rights holding hands. So, to me, the symbolism of that moment is just beyond inspiring.
Beautiful, yeah.
It was beautiful, yeah. So in terms of, thank you, Culture Night. So 2 years ago, when I was able to go to Ireland for Culture Night 2018, when Frederick was 200 years old, I travelled to Ireland and I did a walking tour as part of Culture Night of some of the key points that Frederick had spoken at and that were linked with Frederick in Dublin. I went to Trinity College in Dublin. I lived in Dublin for 15 years. I go back all the time. My daughter was born in Dublin, so I still feel Dublin's my city, but anyway. And I think the maximum number were 40 people on this trip. We had double the number, but we had some guest speakers. We had a Frederick Douglass actor, a young Black Irish 27-year-old who did some beautiful speeches, reenacting Frederick's speeches. Declan O'Rourke, if any of you know the Irish singer, he sang some songs. Eustace Street, the Society of Friends meeting house. So it was very moving. It was very powerful. As we walked around, this big group, we walked around Dublin with a lookalike Frederick Douglass in tow. People must have wondered what we were doing, but it was great. So I was asked, could I do it this year? Obviously, I cannot get to Ireland, but what I'm going to try and do is recreate something virtually online. I have a great actor who's going to do some readings from some of Frederick's speeches while he's in Dublin, and we are going to try and recapture some of the spirit and the energy and I think sense of just being welcome that Frederick felt when he was in Ireland. So that's the 18th of September.
Wonderful. I think, I know that, again, thinking of John Lewis, his good trouble, and I can't help but think that he must have some bit of Frederick Douglass in him, who was famous for his agitate, agitate, agitate. So I think so much of what we're seeing in terms of speaking for those who have not had a voice and making sure that people do is so very emblematic of Frederick Douglass's influence on everyone. Like I said, there's so many questions, but I do want to ask you to react to, how is the Black Lives Matter movement viewed in Ireland? Christine?
Largely, it's totally embraced, really embraced. I don't know if you know, but in Belfast, you saw some of the murals, and Bill Ralston talked about the national murals, which are internationalist. Within a few weeks, they had a mural to George Floyd, which again is so, paying tribute to that. There've been marches. So it's been very well supported. I'm not saying there aren't issues, but it's been very well supported. And if I can just throw out, my guilty pleasure is I'm a soccer fan. I love soccer. That is my weekend.
I do too. I miss live soccer so much.
Okay, so
anyway, they call it football?
Yep. But they have embraced it, and at the start of every game, they've taken the knee, and to me, that is that sort of transatlantic solidarity, which Frederick was trying to promote, is just wonderful. And that's what we need. It has to be transatlantic, it has to be inclusive, and that's the way we affect change.
Well,
Yeah, I've been inspired by the way that Black Lives Matter movement has resonated all over the world. And you know, though there are some that would politicize a statement, Black Lives Matter is not a political statement. It's just about our humanity and our dignity. And so there are those that do politicize it, but it's a statement that people have embraced in many parts of the world. And we see in this country, I've been inspired by the diversity in age, the diversity in race of the protesters that have been on the street. Now, of course, we have a long, long way to go and a lot of work to do. People ask me all the time, what would Frederick Douglass do if he were here today? I do know that he would speak truth to power. He would use his voice, his pen, and his vote. We're in a very important election year here in the United States, presidential election in November, and he would encourage us to agitate. He said to agitate, agitate, agitate. And so I think that if he were here today, he would be pleased to see some of the progress that has been made, and that we did elect the first African-American president, but he would be the first to say that we have not come far enough and we have a long way to go. And if I just may add, I mentioned that we opened an office in Rochester in March of 2019. We're working with organizations there. We're also working with the Irish Studies program at St. John's Fisher College. And we have a vision to build the Frederick Douglass Center for Knowledge, Equality, and Justice. And we've started that process moving forward. And we hope over the next few years, we'll be able to get this center done, which is a great time for us to introduce this. You may have heard that the Rochester Greater International Airport was renamed the Frederick Douglass International Airport recently, or was voted to be renamed, and it hasn't officially changed names yet, but that's coming pretty quickly. And so Frederick Douglass's legacy continues to live on today. We want to lift up the legacy of Anna Murray Douglass, his wife of 44 years, who's really largely been pushed to the side by mostly white male historians who don't give her enough credit for her involvement and her part of this story. And especially since we're commemorating the 19th Amendment, I want to make sure that I lift up her name and her legacy, because I am just as proud of her as I am of him, and I'm just as much a product of her as I am of him.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great evening. And again, it seems, I guess we could be here for hours, but we can't really. But I do want to say that at Solas Nua, certainly we take, great pride from the work of Frederick Douglass, and we have been so proud to tell that story of his journey to Ireland and the transformation that meant for him. I did mention that we will be in October, in conjunction with Black History Month in Ireland, we will be able to replay and revisit some of the scenes and work with some of the creative people who were originally involved in the Frederick Douglass Project. So please keep tuned for that. Also, I want to thank our panelists from the bottom of my heart and from the bottom of the Solas Nua heart for really taking, times from your very, very busy schedules. This is a story that will continue to be told. Solas Nua will continue to tell it. So many questions in the question thing. We're going to figure out how to get answers to those that we were not able to answer. There are questions about, will this be repeated? What I can tell you is we will be able to, at some point soon, put up a recording of the panelist discussion. And certainly, if we are able to and have the time and resources and money, we would look to also rescreening the film. So I want to assure people who came in late that at least you'll be able to hear the kinds of things that have been said by Ken and Christine in context of the film. This is a special event for us because it is the inauguration of our now monthly Irish Popcorn series. And next month, September 30th, we will have another Irish Popcorn series. It'll be a series of shorts from the Summer Galway Film Flap. And in October, we will have October 28th, we will also have a film, Bram Stoker and Dracula, along with one of the speakers there will be the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker. So you can see a pattern here, a pattern in our panelists. And also, please, keep an eye on the Solas Nua website for some of our other things coming up. We now have 3 reading groups that meet monthly, focused on fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. We have our Dublin Voices series that we do in conjunction with the independent bookstore here in Washington, D.C., Politics and Prose. The next series on that is August 28th with Mark O'Connell. So lots of things coming up to keep the story of Irish in America, equity and inclusion, the story of Frederick Douglass. So again, thank you so much for participating in this panel. And thank you to NYU. Thank you to Sean. Thank you to Tom. Thank you to everybody. It's so great to see you both again. And so excited about the work that you're still engaged in, both of you, both on a scholarly and academic level, but also, being on the ground and getting your hands dirty and really taking the message of Frederick Douglass forward and really creating that society that we all strive for.
Thank you. Yeah, and if I may, I just wanted to if people are interested, they can visit our website, which is fdfi.org. And then the Douglas Ireland website is douglasireland.org. So please take a look at the work we're doing, the good work we're doing.
And what we'll do is when we post the recording of the panelist discussion, we will make sure that those website links are directly hyperlinked. So if people can do that then. And Christine, good luck with all your work. Good luck with the virtual tour coming up soon.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Kate. You were great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so thank you all, and we hope to see you at another Solas Nua event, certainly at our next Irish Popcorn event. And thank you for your thoughtful comments, thank you for your attention, and thank you for helping us keep the story of Frederick Douglass and Frederick Douglass in Ireland alive. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Kate. See you soon,
Thank
Christine.
you. Ken, great to see you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.